I always had a hard time explaining to people where I was from. Seems like a simple question, right? Wrong. Born in New York but ethnically Syrian, I lived in 5 different states before moving to Dubai when I was 8. I get a little confused, but apparently I'm not the only one with this problem. Many people who originate from the Middle East and North Africa, or, what people call the MENA region, seem to think this way. We have the same mentality. My name is Leanne, and you're listening to MENA Mentality, a first-hand look into the culture, history, and lives of Middle Eastern and North African people. As of 2016, there are over 1 million MENA immigrants living in the United States. Coming from countries like Iraq, Egypt, Syria, these immigrants settled into cities all over the country. Los Angeles, California, Detroit, Michigan, Chicago, Illinois, all of these places are home to the MENA community. But living in the diaspora can be a little confusing sometimes. So, are there any times where you're maybe confused about your identity or where you come from?
Oh my god, yes. I have an identity crisis, actually.
People say, oh, where are you from? Literally, maybe for a solid 1-2 years, I always said I literally don't know. I genuinely don't know where I'm from.
I don't identify as anything because I don't feel like I am anything, so I'm just like a floating person in space.
You get the idea. We come from so many different ethnic backgrounds, yet we can all relate to the idea of having overlapping identities, some of which fight against each other for dominance. I identify as both Syrian and American, which to anyone would seem like an obvious clash of cultures. But some mixes aren't as obvious. I recently had a conversation with Janan Alkhaja, who was born to a Lebanese mother and an Emirati father, and she walked me through what it's like to be from 2 different Arabic-speaking countries.
So I tell people a lot of times for them to try to understand it is think of different like literally any different country that speaks the same language that has very different cultures and traditions, and you just put them together. So just because you are 2 types of Arab doesn't necessarily mean it's a monolith, because being Arab or being Middle Eastern is it's not the same at all.
And these are things I never really thought about. But she's right. I mean, some countries have things in common, but others could not be more different. For example, even though I'm bilingual and I spent half my life in Dubai, I still have a really hard time understanding the local Arabic dialect. I mean, it's just so different from Syrian Arabic. Janan says as an international student, differences in language is one of the things people assume about her.
I understand where they're coming from, but it's also still a little xenophobic when they go oh, I wouldn't tell your accent's really good, I really thought you were American, you don't sound international, or you don't sound fobby, which if you don't know means fresh off the boat. And so that's not great because it just puts people in a box. It just makes it so that oh, all international students are the same, or if you have an accent or you're passing, then you're more likable or you're more accepted than people who aren't.
And it's true. I have it much easier than most people. I have very fair skin, blue eyes, and blonde hair. I speak Arabic, but I have a very American accent. And yet there are times where I still get put into that little box, like when I get randomly selected at the airport every time I travel. Or when I'm walking around with my family and we share a word or two in Arabic, and then people just stare at us. There's a constant sense of being other. I moved to Dubai in 2005, before the world even knew where or what that was. And let me just tell you, it was all sand. It was literally all sand. But now, when people hear Dubai,
people will kind of just tell you what you are. And so when people want to be condescending, they'll be oh, you're Emirati, this is why you have X, Y, and Z, or this is why you're able to achieve, etc.
As soon as they hear the Dubai, oh, rich girl, oh this, oh that, that's the first thing that comes to mind for most people. So you must have a lot of money, you must have, and I found that common between amongst even my closest friends. People that I've known for 4 or 5 years will still say, "Oh, you're the Dubai girl, or you have a lot of money. How about you help us out?"
If I were to travel to Egypt, they'd say like I'm a bourgeoisie girl, I'm a certain class, I don't deal with a certain kind of like social status because I come from Dubai.
That's my friend Lina Ibrahim.
You know what I mean? They instantly put me in this category, and I hate that. Like, it's like, no, I'm still Egyptian. I can still interact with different types of social classes. It doesn't mean because I come from Dubai, I'm like that. You know what I mean?
So many stereotypes. Dubai has been built up to be this crazy rich dreamland. But in reality, for a lot of people like myself, it's just home. Or at least the closest thing to home we'll ever get. Lina says when she visits Egypt every year, sometimes language gets in the way.
I do feel that disconnect when I do travel back to Egypt. People can instantly tell, although I'm speaking Egyptian, people can instantly tell that I'm not talking the proper Egyptian accent. Here, you kind of take a little bit of like the Lebanese, the Palestinian, the Syrian, and it kind of like, for example, if I say car in Egyptian, it's Arabiya. But I'm used to saying it as Sayyara because that's what people say here. And they can instantly catch on to these small things. So I have to like alter the way I speak, and I have to understand how they talk in Egypt.
Because of the current pandemic, I haven't been able to go back to Dubai. And I'm sure a lot of people who are away from home can relate. I also miss visiting Syria, which, I did every summer until the war started in 2011. Syria is home to what used to be Mesopotamia, and most scholars say that's the world's oldest civilization. It has so much history, and I barely explored any of it.
A few days ago, I was sitting and talking with my parents, and they were showing me pictures of Egypt, and I was like, no way that's Egypt. I couldn't even believe it because it was so beautiful. It was like, it was an island, and the water was crystal blue, like it was beautiful. I was like, no way, this is like probably the Maldives. It's so rich with culture, it's rich with history, it's rich with information. It's literally the root of most of the things that we've discovered today in terms of innovation, in terms of agriculture, in terms of language. I mean, hieroglyphics started there. You get a sense of pride knowing your history and where you come from as well.
Even though I get confused about my identity sometimes, I'm always proud of my history and where I come from. The language, the food, the traditions, the values, everything has shaped who I am today. MENA culture is it's so rich and exciting, but a lot of people seem to take it for granted. My friend Mathew Aboujaoude and I were recently talking about how much we learned to appreciate our culture once we settled into the US.
My connection to being a Lebanese person has definitely grown over time because I only moved to the US when I was 17. Never stepped foot outside of the Middle East until then. And even the first few years I was here, my parents were with me. So when I finally moved here on my own with my brother, that's when I started to realize that I'm starting to slowly lose my connections from my childhood, which is my parents and my home in Lebanon.
Somehow, being away from home makes you appreciate your culture even more. It kind of makes you want to connect to it. I mean, I spent 23 years in an Arabic-speaking household, but only recently started to value the language. Moving away doesn't always have that effect, though. According to data from the US Census, over 10% of MENA immigrants only speak English now. They don't practice their native languages anymore because they're trying to assimilate.
Especially now in quarantine, I haven't been, interacting with people other than, my parents back home, friends back home, and my family here, inside this house. And they both are fluent in Arabic. It's my grandma and my aunt. So whenever I have a phone call in English now, it's kind of weird. And I'm like, oh, I've only been speaking Arabic for quite a while now, and it feels like what it feels like when I was back home.
Family is so important to be around, especially when you're in a place that isn't your home. And when you can't have that, I mean, having a community of people who maybe speak the same language or come from a similar background, it's much needed. My friend Jude Hussein didn't have that community, and maybe if she did, she would feel more connected to Sudan.
I would say that I would have a clearer picture of who I was If my parents had taken kind of like, not the initiative, but if there was more exposure to people from Sudan around me, I feel like I would feel a bit more comfortable, because I'm African and I'm Arab, right? So I'm a bit of both. And like, it's difficult for me to identify with either group.
She described it to me as being too African for the Arabs and too Arab for the Africans. I mean, even though I don't have the same mix, I can relate. I always found it really hard to find friends I could truly relate to. Friends who have the same, I don't know, Arab to Western ratio that I have.
And I feel like another thing that made it worse was that, not made it worse per se, but kind of more alienated me from that kind of society, is that I have the autistic brother. So the way we grew up, it was all very, like, we never really had people visit our home. It's like other Sudani families had other kids, like they, you know, families would get together, kids would play with the kids. I never really had that.
The people you surround yourself with influences you whether you like it or not. Your family, your friends, the schools you go to, the places you live, all of these things, they have a huge impact on a person's sense of identity and culture. Jude actually went to a school full of Arabs.
You know, I felt like I was more lenient towards the whole idea of a culture and identity and individualism, because everybody was different and everybody embraced their Arab roots. But then I also felt really denigrated at a point because I was called the N-word when I was like younger. Even though culture is great and it's fab and we all love it and we love eating the food, we love getting fat, we love getting dressed for weddings, and it's all great and dandy, right? The whole racism aspect of it kind of pushed me away from embracing my roots, because Arabs are very colorist, even amongst themselves. Because my mom, you know, I would have conversations with my mom, she would say, oh, we're not really African, we're Arab. And I was like, okay, well, you married this very dark man, and now you have like a kind of like warm skin tone child and 2 other dark children, you know what I mean?
MENA culture is very collectivist, so our communities mean the world to us. But unfortunately, like every society, we have a lot of flaws. Flaws that can be realized and changed over time. Something as simple as a conversation, like the ones Jude has with her mom, can be enough to spark change. Spending all that time in Dubai was great, but I always tell people that I feel like I'm living in transition. I kind of have this always on the move type of mentality. Like, it's hard to build meaningful relationships because all I can think to myself is, don't get attached, you're leaving soon. But even though I always leave, I always learn in the process. And not to be super cheesy or cliche, but over time I've realized we really aren't so different sometimes.
على فكرة also there في الآية في القرآن اللي بتقول خلقناكم شعوبا وقبائل لتعارفوا.
Lina again, with a verse from the Quran that says God created us and made us different tribes so we could get to know each other. And that's why we have different languages, traditions, races, everything that makes us unique. It's like telling a story. Getting to travel and teach each other about all of these things helps us preserve our culture so we could pass it on to future generations. My Egyptian friend Yasmine Namir taught me a bit about her own traditions.
The thing that helps me like maintain my sense of identity the most is certain habits that I've had since I was young. It's really small things, but they make a difference. So for instance, like every Eid we have like a traditional dish that we eat, and I think it's like also an Arab thing, but that, for example, it allows me to kind of feel like I belong to a certain culture, or I belong to a certain country.
And my family has those traditions too. This past year was my first Ramadan living alone, and my family are always the type who decorate. So I found myself buying fairy lights to feel more at home. And you know, it actually worked a little bit.
What I've come to like learn over time from my own experience is that for me it's not a place, it's more of a feeling. So for example, when I was living in Canada, like for so long I felt like, okay, I'm a bit out of place, I'm not really used to it, I've never lived here before, even though I had so many friends and I liked my classes and everything. But then when my sister moved with me, it felt so much more like home. And I was like, okay, now I'm a bit more comfortable, now I like it, I'm enjoying it now, you know. And that's for me at least, that's more of like how I define my identity or my home than a place. It's like when I'm around my family, anywhere in the world, doesn't matter, that's when I feel like, okay, this place is fine for now.
So, what place is home to you? Do you know? Or do you have the same mentality? My name is Leanne Dehan, and this was MENA Mentality. Special thanks to everyone who shared their stories with me, and please stay tuned for more episodes.